You're watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV from Toronto, Ontario. I'm Catherine Bullock. Assalamu alaikum and greetings of peace. Today, a conversation about systemic racism at the CRA. But first, some news headlines. Government survives unofficial vote of confidence. Mural exhibited for deceased Muslim London family. TARIC Islamic Centre holds 3-day summit on Islamophobia. EU lays out sanctions package for Russia. And now, the details. The House of Commons passed a motion in favour of the Emergencies Act. The New Democrats supported the minority Liberal government, with the Conservatives and Bloc Québécois opposed. The two sitting Greens were split. Parties took the vote as an unofficial vote of confidence in the government. If the Act had not passed, it would have led to an election. The Senate must vote on the Act and could bring it down if it does not pass. The Act will otherwise be in place until mid-March. A mural in remembrance of a Muslim family of 4 killed on June 6 last year was exhibited in White Oaks Mall, London, Ontario on Saturday. Toronto-based artist Arma SM was inspired by 15-year-old victim Yumna Afzal's artwork. He wanted his piece to be a tribute to her dream, he told local media sources. The mural will remain on display until June 6th, marking the 1-year anniversary since the attack. It will then be moved to the London Muslim Mosques Community Centre. Marco Mendicino, the Minister of Public Safety, Ahmed Hussein, the Minister of Diversity, Inclusion and Youth, NDP leader Andrea Horwath and Mayor John Tory sent messages of support to the Toronto and Region Islamic Centre's Countering Islamophobia Summit this past weekend for Family Day. Canadian Muslim News was featured along with 21 other speakers over the 3-day Zoom conference. Elder Kat Krieger shared an Indigenous viewpoint on the theme. The centre's Imam, Sheikh Imran Ali, said that the event was to highlight Muslim voices amid an unprecedented rise of anti-Muslim hate crimes and hate speech. The heads of the European Commission and European Council condemned Moscow's recognition of Ukraine's separatist regions and revealed details of a new sanctions package against Russia today. They pointed out that Russia's actions violate international law and further escalate the crisis in eastern Ukraine. The EU sanctions package will target those involved in recognition of separatist regions of Ukraine and banks financing military operations in those areas. Tensions have recently risen dramatically in eastern Ukraine, with reports of a growing number of ceasefire violations, multiple shelling incidents, and the evacuation of civilians from the pro-Russian separatist regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. And that's it for the news. There's a lot going on with the Freedom Convoy right now. Prime Minister has invoked the Emergencies Act for the first time in Canadian history. Now organisers are being arrested, bank accounts being frozen. This brings up one little story that was covered briefly in the news about an Islamic charity that had launched a defamation lawsuit against one of the organisers. And it reminds us about an ongoing analysis that shows that there is systemic anti-Muslim racism at the CRA related to these issues of quote-unquote alleged terrorist financing. To talk to us today about his analysis called UnDelayed Suspicion, we have Professor Anver Emon, Law Prof at the University of Toronto. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the show.
Alaikum assalam and thank you for having me.
So that was a bit of a long introduction and there's really a lot going on, a lot to talk about. We don't have a lot of time. I just wanted to focus in on this story of the terrorist financing. The national security apparatus is now targeting white supremacy movements, freezing bank accounts. Do you think Muslim organizations should feel relieved or concerned?
To be honest, I think it's both. On the one hand, we have existing legislation since 2001 that's allowed the government and in doing so, conscripting our banks as soldiers in the war on terror to report on suspicious transactions. They've been doing this already. The real problem here isn't that they are going to do it more, it's that they obviously seem to miss a whole swath of what we would call perhaps radical white radicals, white terrorists, or white extremists, for reasons that are of alarm, that are concerning to me. And so I'm on the fence on that question.
I'm a little bit on the fence too, but we know people who were picked up for making a $10,000 donation, and suddenly that becomes suspicious. That makes us feel about the anti-Muslim racism. So now we have the state apparatus using the same kinds of potentially oppressive tools on another group, but they're a group that target Muslims. So maybe it's a good thing, but maybe we don't want the state to be acting like that at all.
Well, I think that is the issue, right? My concern, and again, my focus on the state with respect to the national security apparatus has been, how does it use its apparatus on Muslim identified groups, in particular charities? The concern that I have, and that we show in Underlayered Suspicion, is that, at least with respect to charities, the financial establishment, the financial security apparatus, the auditing apparatus relies on highly suspect evidence. And so we were able to show patterns of evidentiary bias, evidence selection bias, interpretive bias, all of which were very result oriented. And so the concern I have now with the turn to white supremacists is, while I appreciate that perhaps this might help reduce the sting of Islamophobia, it does mean, from a civil liberties perspective, we may very well be enabling the state to do to another group what it's already done to Muslims, rather than address the human frailties in the very process of assessing and interpreting what financial transactions mean. And that's the real problem here, I think.
So let's dig in a little bit more to that report. It was called UnDelayed Suspicion. It came out in the summer last year, and the report makes a claim of systemic anti-Muslim bias at the CRA. Just in a couple of minutes, can you explain that finding for us?
Sure. What we did was we looked at 3 different case studies of audits of Muslim organizations, charities that had their charitable status revoked. And what we found across all 3 was, one, a whole of government anti-terrorism financing policy that was facially structured in a way that was predisposed against Muslims. That policy identifies 10 organizations that Canada believes poses the greatest threat for terrorist financing. Of the 10, 1 was Tamil, 1 was Sikh, and 8 were Muslim identified. So that means, as per Canadian policy, 100% of terrorist financing risk is posed by groups that map onto racial and religious minorities in Canada. 80% or more map onto Muslim groups in Canada. And that has nothing, and nowhere in that list is white supremacy or whatnot. So at least facially, we know that policy exists and we've identified it. The concern is that policy has implications for how every ministry then will look at Muslim organizations on terrorist financing. And the CRA is one of those. And what we saw in the audits was a pattern of bias in the way they selected evidence, in the sourcing of evidence, in the interpretation given to that evidence, always with a very particular implication that these groups are almost, before they're even fully audited, they're already suspected of having committed terrorist financing crimes. And then the issue is the audit ends up becoming more of a fishing expedition to prove the conclusion they have already made. That was the concern we had in these 3 cases.
You mentioned human frailty, you mentioned selection bias. I remember reading in the report accounts of where you say that the Islamic charities you investigated were held to account for practices that are common across the sector.
Charities have overhead costs that they try to limit in order to maximize the good, the benefit that they then provide their larger community. So the academic literature on charities suggests that no charity is 100% compliant with the relevant state income tax act. The problem, though, is that those violations of the Income Tax Act are used as pretext to justify a revocation, when in fact the real suspicion is something else. The government of Canada, the CRA, we were able to find in Senate testimony, the head of the CRA at the time and the head of the intelligence division within the CRA testified to the fact that they try not to use the anti-terrorism financing special powers they have to deregister Muslim charities. They tend to prefer the standard approach, looking for Income Tax Act violations as a way to approach these issues. And so the concern we have is a lack of transparency, a lack of accountability. If organizations are suspected of terrorist financing, they're never told. This is, again, per Senate testimony that we found this out. And these are real concerns for the way in which we imagine the rule of law working against all of us through the coercive arms of the state. At the same time, we need to acknowledge that as volunteer organizations, Muslim charities don't always keep the best records. Not all of them do. It's costly to maintain effective compliance. And one of the concerns that needs to be raised within the larger context of Muslim civil society is, how do we organize? How do we manage record keeping? How do we manage to make sure we're compliant? But more troublingly for me, and that I saw in this context, is that Muslim charities are in a unique position where, when they're audited, normally you would think time to get your CFO, your chief financial officer, or your certified accountant into the picture. But increasingly, it's not just that. You almost always need your lawyer now as well. So for charities, it means raising your overhead costs of compliance and human resource personnel simply to deal with what ought to be an ordinary measure of a tax audit, but which in these contexts, under the terrorist financing regime, are oftentimes quite extraordinary.
They are extraordinary and very targeted, and in a way using the Tax Act as a smokescreen for, as you said, another agenda.
No, it is. It was alarming for us to find that testimony in the Senate here in Canada. They basically seem to suggest that they'd rather use the Tax Act as the mechanism to go after these organizations, even if they suspect terrorist financing, on basis that they never disclose. So in one of the cases that we examined, in fact, it was the Irfan Canada case. Irfan Canada was audited. They had no reason to think that their audit was in any way out of the ordinary. But the nature of the audit was very extensive. It was multiple years, and it wasn't until they got a lawyer, and that lawyer checked the parliamentary record, that they realized that the only reason they're being audited is because an MP complained about them during question period on grounds that were highly suspect to begin with.
And unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack. We'll probably have you back on another show. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You've been watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Stay safe. Stay tuned for the next episode.